Hi, and welcome to another one of our vlogs about the say-do gap. Why is it people often say one thing and end up doing another thing? Well, we all know now, because of the work that's come out of the studying of the mind and behavioural economics, that a lot of the reason why people do say one thing and do another is because a lot of the things that cause our behaviour are beyond our conscious control and our conscious awareness, so that we may be aware that we're acting in a certain way, but we may not be aware why we're doing that. And as researchers, this of course is quite a challenge. But I want to tell you today a little story about a little side interest of mine that's been going for a couple of years now. And it's essentially about the story of the cognitive bias that you've never heard of. So if you look on Wikipedia, there are 185 cognitive biases listed. This is the 186th. And it is a whimsical, it's meant as a whimsical, amusing kind of story about how sometimes our mind can, the way our mind works can lead us to have beliefs that aren't exactly true, and how these can become embedded in culture. And the story starts in Madame Tussauds. So about many years ago, more than I would care to mention, I was finishing my PhD and I managed to get a job working for a TV production company as a way of paying my way to what I was writing up. And we ended up visiting lots of exciting places like Madame Tussauds. And Madame Tussauds, of course, is a famous waxwork in London, and they were filming various things like the modelling behind, you know, how they ran the place. But the story that intrigued me was we filmed them repairing one of the waxworks. In fact, the waxwork that was damaged by far the most of all the waxworks in Madame Tussauds. Now you think this would be like an evil dictator or a politician, but it wasn't. It was Linford Christie, Britain's greatest sprinter and one of Britain's greatest ever athletes. Now, why would he get damaged? Well, Linford had come into the sport at a time which they'd sort of worked out that having a pair of flappy shorts and a flappy vest wasn't as good as running in an all-in-one lycra bodysuit, and it made you go faster. So Linford wore this, and people couldn't help but notice that he was rather well endowed in a certain area. And this kind of became known as Linford's lunchbox. And he became sort of the kind of archetype idea of a kind of a gentleman of African origin having large genitalia. And he massively objected to this, and for reasons which I will explain in a minute. But this was the one thing that made people interact with his waxwork the most, is that when they were walking around and they were not meant to be touching anything, they couldn't resist squeezing out and having a little feel of Linford's lunchbox. And of course they had to go and replace his bodysuit about every sort of 6 to 8 weeks, because it just happened so often. It was actually would wear out. So when I kind of was watching this being filmed, it reminded me of a talk I went to many years ago by a guy called Leon Kamin. Now Kamin was a very famous psychologist, did a lot of work on kind of nature and nurture, and he believed that a lot was more nurture than it was nature. But he gave a talk on this very topic about how certain ethnicities are perceived as having different sized genitals. And he equally objected to it for good reasons, because all the data that was out there was all self-report, and we know self-report data. As you know, I'm not a massive fan of self-report data. It's useful in some contexts, but not in others. And if you're asking people to report that part of their anatomy, you're probably not going to get very good data out of it. But what Leon Kamin did do was actually research one study that he found where the criteria were correct. And it's kind of a lesson in how to do good research. Because in this case, what you need is a lot of men of different backgrounds all in the same place at the same time. You'd need there to be some kind of hierarchical structure, because you didn't want people to be sort of, you know, self-choosing to go into the study. There had to be kind of some kind of incentive and some scientist there who could sort of was able to measure everything correctly. And of course, you'd have to have massive amounts of time on your hand, because quite frankly, there are far better things to worry about than that. But this had happened once in history at that point. And it was in 1889, and it was in the French Foreign Legion. And it just seems, for some reason, they decided they would do all these kind of measurements and metrics of their soldiers and work out who basically had what and what was going on. So what they did is they wrote up the data, and it managed to explode many myths, because they measured willy size, and they showed that actually there were a lot of things which just weren't true. So for example, there was a whole kind of idea about hand size relating to willy size. Donald Trump came up very recently on that very topic, and that was found not to be true. And the same with kind of, you know, foot size again. Foot size again was something which people thought would be related, but it wasn't at all. And even depth of voice was something, and that was actually first proposed by Aristotle, who believed that depth of voice was corresponded to gentle size. All of this was debunked, and of course the one thing they massively debunked was the fact that there was no relationship between ethnicity and genital size. And this is why Linford Christie had objected to this quite rightly and so much, was because he knew where it came from. And it came from a really, really bad place, because it started with the slave trade. Basically, back in the 17th, 18th century, when slave trade was rife, the slave traders were obviously good, God-fearing men, so they would never enslave or treat another human being like that. So the little bit of mental gymnastics that they did to get round it was to consider the people they were enslaving as not being human. And they kidded themselves that they were more animalistic than themselves. And because of that, they had these raging libidos they couldn't control, like animals had. And because of that, they had large genitals, which actually makes no sense if you think about it. And the thing is that Leon Kamin has sort of looked into this, and he'd found other references as well from people who, like the first people who went out into these kind of new worlds. And they'd kind of interact and converse with the natives eventually. And they kind of said these native people would sort of, you know, say, hey, you never guess what? We know when we first saw you, we thought those funny things that you wear around your legs, you call them trousers, don't you? Yeah, we thought you wore those because your willies were so big you had to wrap them around yourselves and keep them tucked in. So it seemed to work the opposite way around as well, which is a bit weird. But it kind of showed there might be some commonality going on. And Leon Kamin had sort of, he didn't really know why, but he cited a few studies saying, you know, if you look at kind of, you know, get people to look at pictures of big, muscly white guys, they kind of get more impressive and they get bigger and they get kind of, you know, sort of handsomer. But actually, if you get closer to them, you know, they just look good. Whereas if you do it with a black guy, they get bigger, more impressive, more handsome, but they also get a little bit scarier. So he hypothesized that perhaps that was something to do with it, that somehow there was something to do with fear and this kind of perception of willy size. And he sort of basically came up with this kind of possible heuristic saying, maybe fear, if you're scared of somebody, you think they've got a big willy. So how could you test that? Well, about 4 or 5 years ago, I got the opportunity to. And through a very strange kind of means, because there's a very long-running radio show in the UK called The Archers. It's a soap opera. And it's possibly, I think, the longest-running radio drama in the world. It's been going for 60-odd years. Anyway, but I have a friend who runs the world's only conference on The Archers. And knowing this, we thought we could do a little experiment, because I didn't realise, but apparently, if you're a fan of The Archers, the one thing you never talk about to another Archers fan is what the Archers look like, what the individual characters look like. You don't look at that because you all have your own kind of personal view, and you wouldn't want to kind of destroy anybody else's. So we could make use of that, because we thought, well, if everybody has their own personal view, perhaps if people could correlate, we could find a correlation between kind of the fear and the sort of the intimidation factor of each of these characters and perceived willy size. Maybe we could find a connection. And so we did the research. We did about sort of 300 or 400 people online, and we got some very interesting comments back. And very pleasingly, we actually even made the front page of BBC's Radio 4 website when the conference happened, which was very impressive. Well, it impressed me anyway. because we actually found this near perfect correlation between perceived fear and willy size. And this is the first time anybody had found any evidence of this being the case. Very strange. But if you think about it in culture, this kind of phenomenon kind of exists, that if you're scared of somebody, you think they've got a big willy. You know, the guy in the office is always shouting and bullying people. He's compensating for something, i.e. a bit of reverse psychology, because actually you think he might have something quite big. Big cars, often considered well associated with that part of the anatomy. And of course in America, guns are very much associated with that part of the anatomy. And of course, big gun means something else. And of course, guns are very, very scary. So it does sort of make sense. As it happens, since I started doing this a few years ago, there has been an actual proper scientific study on the topic, and certainly this kind of difference that was highlighted about Linford Christie has definitely been debunked. It is absolutely not true. And so it really does show the kind of way in which this weird little quirk of our mind has led to this really culturally embedded idea which simply isn't true. And if anybody is kind of interested as well, does it matter? Well, it doesn't, because another study came out a few years ago which showed that actually if you create avatars and they manipulated shoulder and hip ratio, height and willy size, and basically if you had a broad shoulders and skinny hips, that was the thing that people that found most attractive, and everything else was pretty much irrelevant. So if anybody is watching this who does have any kind of sense of fear about it, kind of don't worry, just buy yourself a set of shoulder pads, it's far easier. So with all of this, as researchers, we have to be aware of these kind of weird heuristics. We have to be aware of how to do research properly, like Leon Kamin did. He came at a sort of a very odd topic, but actually thought it through in a very sort of logical, scientific way. And it's something which we can all as researchers benefit from, thinking about objectivity and how we think about the way the world works, and understanding to be able to predict what people are going to do. I hope you found this slightly tongue-in-cheek and slightly amusing, but hopefully serious as well. And I hope to join me at some point in the near future for more talks about the say-do gap. Thank you.